he says the little boy kept saying, "You're not supposed to do that. My mom has told me you're not supposed to touch me there." And he says, "I knew if I let him go, he would tell, and then you guys would come."
With a voluntary confession, prosecutors anticipate an open and shut case. But at trial, Arthur Bishop's defense would take a shocking strategy. In the space of one Sunday afternoon in Salt Lake City, Don Bell had discovered a serial killer that no one even knew existed.
You don't come up with a missing person and your first thought is, I have some serial killer, pedophile person out there doing. That's just not on the radar as the #1 thought process.
Arthur Bishop finishes his gruesome tale in less than an hour. Fearful he will withdraw cooperation again, Detective Bell asks Bishop to take police to the boys' graves that night. He agrees to lead them into the desert, 40 miles southwest of town.
Detective Smith and another detective by the name of Johnson took him out to the desert, and it was dark. It was 10 o'clock at night, and he walked him right to the grave sites, even in pitch black dark. And that, later we found out he'd gone back to the graves and visited them periodically, so he was quite familiar.
Bishop's first 3 victims, Alonzo Daniels, Kim Peterson, and Danny Davis, were buried in shallow graves in Utah's West Desert. He took the bodies of Troy Ward and Graham Cunningham to the Wasatch Mountains and threw them into Big Cottonwood Creek, 15 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Bishop's confession comes 10 days after Graham's disappearance. His mother, Shona, frantic with worry, still has no inkling of the terrible truth. Detectives now face the awful task of breaking the news to her.
They came to the house the next morning and brought the chaplain. I mean, that's the dead giveaway. And we sat down at the table, and they told us that Art had confessed to the murders of the 5 children. He took Graham from me that night. He knew Graham was at home, I was at home. He took him from us, literally. That was his control. It was the godlike power of deciding whether it was going to be life or death.
By the end of the week, the Salt Lake County Attorney's Office charges Bishop with 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault on Graham Cunningham.
We had some pretty bad ones. We'd had multiple murderers. We had people who had, done all sorts of murders. But to have 5 over a period of time, calculated, cold.
On March 3rd, 1984, Bishop's trial begins at Salt Lake City's Hall of Justice. The parents of each one of his victims are in court to hear him plead not guilty.
I had to sit and look at him. I didn't have to. I didn't need to go there, but I was bound and determined he was going to see my face if I had to look at his. And he was quite relaxed. He turned and smiled, like, oh, there's somebody I know. I mean, it was so unreal.
With Bishop's confession in hand, the prosecution has no concerns about proving he killed the boys. But to secure the death penalty, they still must prove each killing was a calculated, deliberate act. Lead prosecutor Robert Stott opens his case by painting a stark picture of the defendant, a predatory pedophile and serial killer masquerading as an upright citizen.
We tried to show how reasonable he was, how he could act normal, and how he did act normal, and how he could deceive people.
Then on March 13th, Bishop's attorneys begin their defense with a daring strategy.
They were shooting for manslaughter, claiming that he had killed them under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance for which there was a reasonable explanation or excuse.
Bishop's lawyers try to persuade the jury that, fueled by pornography and coupled with his insatiable lust for young boys, Bishop developed murderous impulses that he is unable to control. When he found himself in the presence of his victims, he unthinkingly lashed out. They suggest that, in effect, each murder was an accident.
The reason he killed was not because of the pornography, not because he was desensitized, but because he was afraid these little boys were going to tell their parents, and they would tell the police, and he would go to prison.
The prosecution's case lasted for 2 weeks. Bishop's attorneys rest after just 2 days. On March 19th, the jury retires to consider its verdict. They must choose between manslaughter and first-degree murder. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury quickly reaches a verdict in the trial of Arthur Bishop.
I can't remember how long they were out, but they were going to send them to the hotel. And within minutes, they came back and said, no, the jury has a verdict. So we all went back into court. And that's when they read the verdict.
Bishop is found guilty on all 11 counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder.
Some people made some noise of appreciation for the verdict, which really wasn't appropriate, but everybody was so high-strung.
2 days after their guilty verdicts, the court reconvenes to decide if Bishop will be sent to prison for life or if he will be put to death.
We had a psychologist go down and interview him, and he called me afterwards and he said there was one time where it appeared that he was expressing some remorse, and he said, Danny Davis, what a waste. And I thought he was going to say, you know, poor little boy died, you know, and instead he said, I didn't get any sexual satisfaction out of it. So it appeared to be, if there was any justification for the ultimate sanction under Utah law, this was the case.
Oh, I had no doubt. I had absolutely no doubt this man had to die.
To try and persuade the jury to recommend the death sentence, prosecutors present a chilling insight into the mind of Arthur Gary Bishop.
During the trial, we presented the testimony of the confession through Don Bell. It was at the penalty phase that we actually played the tape, because the impact of that, actually hearing his words and his voice, was so chilling. And it was very powerful.
Actually, in a way, I feel good telling about this, but at the same time, I know I'm damning myself to hell for doing it. Well, my friend, but I'm glad you caught me, because I couldn't stop, and I would go do it again if I had the chance. Because I get around little kids and I start shaking, I get nervous. It's just not right.
The jury deliberates for almost 11 hours. Then, at close to 1 in the morning, they return with their verdict.
Well, it's gratifying to know that 12 people agreed with us that this case, the only just penalty was death.
Well, you can say you're relieved, or you're pleased, or you're happy, or you're... I felt the proper verdict came back.
On March 27, 1984, Bishop is given 5 death sentences. He has 1 automatic appeal before the Utah Supreme Court in 1985. His lawyers argue that the jury was biased against him and that his confession was inadmissible in court because he was not allowed to exercise his right to silence. These arguments are rejected. The court rules that his death sentence stands.
Art, would you rather die than life in prison? Yes.
Under Utah laws of the time, Bishop can choose his method of execution: firing squad or lethal injection. His choice of death by lethal injection is carried out on June 10th, 1988.
You know, time doesn't heal. Forget that. But if suddenly you lost your leg, or your arm, or your life changed so drastically that you had to find a different way to live,